About a month and a half after MH370 disappeared, the Prime Minister of Australia came out in front of a press conference and he made what I think is the most egregiously false statement that any official made during the course of the entire investigation. This is what the Prime Minister said.
The point I make is that Australia will not rest until we have done everything we humanly can to get to the bottom of this mystery.
Australia will not rest until we've done everything we possibly can to get to the bottom of this mystery. That was different from other statements that officials have made because it was a promise. It was a kind of a contract between the search officials and the public. And that promise was not kept. Yes, Australia did engage in a 2-year-long effort, very intensive, very expensive, to search the southern seabed and to find the plane. They did not succeed. They gave up. They issued a report the following year that said, basically, this is what we did. This is why we couldn't find it. And in retrospect, we look back and we say, well, of course they couldn't find it. The ocean is huge. You know, things go missing. That's just the way it is. But remember, at the time, a month and a half after the plane had disappeared, the officials, Tony Abbott, the Prime Minister, they believed that they were going to find the plane. They felt that they could make this promise in good faith. And they were wrong. And so in today's episode, we're going to talk about why they thought that they could do it and why they were wrong and what we can do about it now. Hi, my name is Jeff Wise. I'm an aviation writer, a science journalist. I'm a private pilot. I've flown a wide variety of aircraft. I wrote a book called The Taking of MH370. You might know me from the Netflix documentary MH370, The Plane That Wasn't There. I'd like to welcome you to the second season of Deep Dive MH370. This is episode 1. The goal is the same as in the first season. We did 31 episodes where we laid out the basics of what evidence we had, what happened to the plane in the course of that night that it disappeared, in the course of the months of the investigation, ultimately the years that followed the search, the second search, and ultimately where we are today. We're going to continue that here in the second season. As you might have noticed, it's just me alone right now. My co-host from the first season, Andy Tarnoff, is no longer with me. The goal right now is to try to focus on bringing in voices of outside experts, people who have specific knowledge of their domains of expertise, to try to get even more granular, to really understand all of the missing bits and bobs that can help us try to solve this mystery. And as I alluded to earlier in the show, we are tasked with trying to figure out where the authorities went wrong. The authorities have never acknowledged that there was anything wrong in their approach. And in the people who are sympathetic to the authorities' point of view, they didn't do anything wrong. It just didn't work out the way that they had expected, and that's completely understandable. To my mind, that isn't wrong. That isn't right. I think that really there was an epic failure here, perhaps the greatest failure in the history of civil aviation, because in failing to answer the mystery, to failing to figure out what happened to this plane, we have left a huge gap in public safety. Something happened to these 239 people. We don't know what. And so long as we don't know what, we can't prevent it from happening again. And so you and me and everyone who flies is at potential risk for succumbing to the fate of whatever happened to these people. Now, a lot of people will say, well, you know, you're barking up the wrong tree. We know what happened. There's nothing to worry about. we didn't find it for various reasons that we don't quite understand, but we pretty much know what happened and it's going to be fine. That is an attitude that I think is extremely dangerous, because I have pointed out in the previous season, I will continue to point out in this season, that there are many pieces of evidence that indicate that we should not be so smug and complacent. There are major holes in the theory that the authorities, including the Australian Prime Minister, Tony Abbott at the time, had come to believe. And so this, in an environment in which a security threat may exist, it is very dangerous to adopt the attitude of probably everything's fine. Because if there's a very high, or at least reasonable probability that things are not all right, that actually the world is a more dangerous place than you have let yourself believe, you are very vulnerable. I see that there is MH370 involves a failure at two levels. On the first level, there is the failure to get the passengers to their destination. The plane vanished. That is a failure. There's a broader, sort of more meta level failure, which is the failure to understand why the first failure occurred. In the course of the season that will follow, my goal is to attack those two failures hand in hand, to continue to lay out the evidence, which we got into to a large extent in episode 1, but a lot remains. I want to continue to dive into that. I also want to broaden out the lens, as it were, and try to grapple with why we, as a culture, have failed to grapple with this mystery and have failed to grapple with so many other burning issues like it. There seems to be a kind of blockage in the system. We are unable to grapple with issues that are complicated and difficult and tendentious, and we find ourselves running around in circles. And I want to try to address that, at least in the context of MH370, and figure out how it is we got to where we are today. And this all turns back eventually to Tony Abbott's statement, "We will not rest until we have done everything we can," and the failure that ensued in the wake of that promise. So let's talk about why Tony Abbott felt he could make that statement. And it goes back to the night that the plane disappeared. Because as we know, just to rehash the basics, the plane took off from Kuala Lumpur heading to Beijing on a red-eye flight. 40 minutes into the flight, everything went electronically dark. The plane took a 180, went back over the Malayan Peninsula, flew up the Malacca Straits, left the area of primary radar coverage, and was invisible. It was gone. It was free and clear. But then 3 minutes later, the satellite communication system got turned back on, and it started to send these pings that Australian scientists were later able to determine where the plane had gone in the southern Indian Ocean. And when Tony Abbott made that statement, when he made that promise, he had in mind a particular piece of evidence that he thought, and that the other search officials thought, basically was a giveaway to what happened. And this is the fact that there was just a minute just before the plane did its first diversion, that moment when everything went dark. The captain, Zahari Ahmadchat, said, "Good night, Malaysian MH370. Good night, Malaysian 370." And there was only a minute from that to everything getting turned off and going dark. So given that the pilots were in this locked cockpit and such a short amount of time had elapsed, there was no time for hijackers to burst into the cockpit and take over or anything like that. So it must have been Zahari. And so given that Zahari must have taken the plane and that the signal showed that it went into the Southern Ocean, the whole case seemed sewn up. They knew what had happened. And using those signals, they were able to determine with a fair degree of precision where the plane had gone. And so at that moment, a month and a half after the plane disappeared, that Tony Abbott made that statement, he believed wholeheartedly that it was just a matter of sending down ships to scan the seabed and they would find the wreckage. And later, even after that search failed, Tony Abbott went on a different Australian TV show, and he explained to the interviewer why he thought that Zaharie had done that.
Tony Abbott has revealed exactly what the Malaysians believed within a week of the plane's disappearance.
My understanding, my very clear understanding from the very top levels of the Malaysian government is that from very, very early on here, they thought it was murder-suicide by the pilot.
They said that to you?
I'm not going to say who said what to whom, but let me reiterate, I want to be absolutely crystal clear. It was understood at the highest levels that this was almost certainly murder-suicide by the pilot.
So Abbott had heard from the Malaysians that they were very confident that this was the case. And so when the seabed search commenced, there was very little doubt in his mind, or in the mind of the authorities as a whole, that this is what had happened and that the plane would soon be found. Of course, it wasn't. And what do you do when your theory doesn't pan out? You could just assume that you were right and that, you know, it didn't give you the results that you wanted because, you know, one of your assumptions was wrong. But basically, your picture is more or less accurate. You just sort of missed out some details, and so you don't need to worry that you were wrong. You certainly were right, but you just must have, some of the details must have gotten wrong. By the time Abbott had filmed this interview, the seabed search had already failed. And he already knew that the hypothesis that the Australian scientists had been working under was wrong, at least to the extent that the plane was not where they thought it was. And so what do you do? You know, well, what he did and what the authorities have done and what those who are sympathetic to the murder-suicide scenario have done is just to reassure themselves that they are correct. And they don't know why. One of their assumptions must have been wrong. But there's another thing that you can do, and I think that you should do. This is what I'm advocating. I've advocated for it in season 1. I'm going to continue to advocate in season 2, which is that you go back and you look at all of your data and you try to figure out where you went wrong. Look at all the evidence again. Look at it more closely. Get new experts. Get new interpretations. And that's what I'm going to continue to do. In season 2, I'm going to continue to unravel this thread of mystery, as it were. And to that end, what I want to do now is introduce the first guest of the season. One of the major, mysteries, on par, I would say, with the clue that there was only a minute between Goodnight Malaysian 370 and everything going dark, was the fact that one of the things that went dark was the satellite communication system. In particular, a piece of equipment called the Satellite Data Unit, or the SDU. All of the other things that were turned off at that time have switches, or you can do it from the control panel. The SDU does not have an on-off switch. And so the only way you can do it, there's 3 ways that you can turn it off and back on again. One is to leave the cockpit, go down into the electronics bay and pull 3 circuit breakers. But because that 1 minute time span, it doesn't seem like there would be enough time for the pilot to do that. From the cockpit, there remains 2 ways you can do it. One is to turn off a portion of the electrical system that the satellite data unit is attached to. And the other is to turn off the entire electrical system. And so in the rest of today's episode, we're going to talk to somebody who went into a Cat D simulator, Category D flight simulator, and was able to find out what happens when you do either of these last two things, when you isolate either a part or the entirety of the electrical system. The reason why this matters is that for people who think that Zahari took the plane, they have to just assume that he did this action and that there was no problem with it. And what I have said, I've said it in an earlier episode in season 1, and I want to delve deeper into it now, is that, first of all, pilots don't know how to do this. This is something that is specialized knowledge that is generally not available to pilots. And every time I talk to a new 777 pilot that I meet or come across, I always say, how do you turn off the SDU? And they invariably say, I don't know. In fact, here's a case. Here's some audio of an interview I did with a 777 pilot I met for the first time just the other day.
Can you tell me what airline you fly with?
Yeah, I'm captain on a Boeing 777 and 787 at KLM Royal Dutch Airlines.
And here's a question I always ask every 777 pilot I meet. How would you reboot the satellite data unit?
No idea. I have no idea.
Okay. That's the answer everyone gives me.
For pilots, this information is just not available. So I think you really need to look into more technical information, which is generally not available for us, but maybe for engineers.
So pilots don't know how to do this, and they also wouldn't know how to do it. And so the third part of the puzzle is that a pilot who is going to start turning off big chunks of the electrical system might not know exactly what is going to happen. Because you would have to really delve into the hundreds of pages of documentation to try to understand like what is attached to what circuit. And even once you figured out what equipment lies in what circuit, you wouldn't have full confidence that that's actually what the plane would do in that real world situation, because there's this feature of a 777 called an electrical load management system, or ELMS. And this is an automated system that will try to restore electrical power to systems that lose it, because the 777 is an electrical plane and it always wants to have electrical power to as many things as possible. So the point just being, it's a very much an open question, is if you start pulling a lot of circuit breakers, it's not entirely clear what's going to happen to the plane. And so if your plan to steal the plane and commit suicide involves doing this, you're introducing a lot of unnecessary risk to your plan, because you're doing something that involves a lot of unknowns for which there appears to be no obvious benefit. Okay, so to try to figure out what the consequences of this kind of electrical isolation would be, to really have a full picture, you would have to take an actual 777 up into the air and start pulling circuit breakers and see what happens. Obviously, that would be very dangerous. It's not something you certainly would want to do with passengers in the back. You could try to do it in a flight simulator like you would just buy off the shelf and use for recreation, but we don't really know how accurate those are. We don't know if you do something on the screen in the game, how realistically that would correlate to what would happen in real life. The best that we can do is find a highly realistic simulator, a Category D simulator. And we found somebody who went onto the simulator recently, just a few days ago, and I had asked him to pull some of these circuits and see what happens. He reported back to me under the stipulation that he wanted to protect his identity. So what we're going to be hearing is audio only, and I'm going to run it through an AI so that we can't identify his voice, because he feels like he doesn't want to get himself in trouble or the person who helped him access the simulator. I don't know why. But I think that I hope that doesn't detract from the credibility of what he is going to tell us. If anybody, I don't think what he's saying is going to be highly controversial. And I think if anyone feels that any aspect of this is controversial, they can go and book time in a category D simulator themselves and tell us that we're wrong. Again, it's probably not very controversial, but I think it is really interesting to try to nail down all the details that we can. And this is something I've been wanting to poke into for a long time. So let's go to that interview with someone who has recently experienced a Cat D simulator. Bob is not your real name, but we're protecting your identity so nobody gets in trouble. What is a Cat D simulator?
A Cat D simulator, basically it is the highest level of sophistication that you can get in aviation simulators. These simulators have been created to simulate as closely as possible the real world environment. For example, the simulators have something that's called 6 degrees of freedom. So we already know from flying, we have pitch, roll, and yaw, but the Level D simulators go one step further, and there are 3 more motions, and that's surge, which is forward and backward, heave, which is up and down, and sway, which is the cab actually moving.
So unlike a flight simulator that you would buy, online and play on your home computer, you are sitting in a machine that is physically responding to your inputs. So if you push the stick forward, you are like leaning forward. So it kind of feels like you're turning and banking and so forth. So it gives you that physical sensation. For present purposes, what's even more important is that these planes are hyper realistic in how they respond to the switches and the toggles and all of the different things, so that if a pilot wants to simulate, say, an engine out failure or a cockpit fire, the things that he does in the simulator are a good and accurate and faithful model of what would happen in the plane. So this is intended to save lives, really. This is intended to give pilots an accurate understanding of what will happen under pressure. And this is why this is such an exciting opportunity, because we want to know what happens if you switch off parts or entire electrical systems. And you can't do that in a real plane. It's not safe, but we can do it safely. In this environment, you're able to get into it. And this is why it's so exciting. So I want to ask you, we talked earlier and you told me that you were able, first of all, to do the first thing the first way that you can turn off the satellite data unit of the component of the SATCOM. You isolated the left AC bus, and I was hoping we could talk a little bit about how you did that and what the result was.
You're in that damn, it's very realistic, and as soon as you start pressing the buttons, before you press the buttons, you think for a second and wonder, okay, what do I have to be ready for? And it was a bit of an anticlimactic moment, because as soon as I had the left generator switch off, nothing really happened. A couple of indications came up on the center screen, which is called the ICAS. And that's where you're going to see all your warnings and information is on that central screen. A few things came up on there, and strangely enough, with that single press, the SATCOM was on the list. And I know you've been interested in the SATCOM situation for a long time, and the SDU, the Satellite Data Unit. And to see that happen that quickly after you have been wondering for so long, that was anticlimactic as well, because that was a simple thing to do.
Were there other things that were on the list, or was the SATCOM pretty much it?
Whatever button you press, whatever you turn off is indicated on the list. We have things like SATCOM, the TCAS, Collision Highway System. So any of the, that's a very important system too. The TCAS is certainly important. Fuel pump right forward, window heat right side, random kinds of things. It's kind of like, right, if you turn off a breaker in your house, and you can look at your panel in your house like a bus. It's a collection of connections where electricity is distributed. So turn off one breaker, you might lose a plug or a few plugs in the wall, but not the light in the ceiling, because you never want to put everything together on the same breaker. So this thinking, I would assume, is in the architecture of the electrical of any aircraft. You don't want to blow out a whole area of the aircraft. You want to have some of this removed, yeah, with that one action. But as another system you may or may not be aware of is the ELMS, the electronic management system. The ELMS is working in the background, and it's shuffling things around. When something is deactivated, that's why nothing's happening when I'm deselecting these buttons, because the ELMS is working hard to correct or to shed loads or to transfer loads from whatever that generator was doing to the critical places. And then you see the list on the ICAS. It grows to the point of you have to start selecting another button to scroll through the failed items.
You're saying that this is when you've isolated the left AC bus, other stuff starts to fail?
Other things will turn off for sure. There's a short list, but there is only one page at this point on the ICAS.
Okay.
It's a very benign thing. Losing one generator, very benign.
Okay. I myself have used this analogy of the circuit breakers in your home, where if you want to, you can turn off the TV either by switching off the TV, or you can go into the basement and pull the circuit breaker on your whole living room. But as you point out, this is a little bit different because you have this ELMS, this automated system that's kind of like, it's more like if you switched off, the circuit breaker in your living room, but then there was a robot that that had the power to automatically like reconnect things in a way that you might not fully understand. So for a long time, people who believe that the pilot committed murder-suicide and disconnected the SATCOM from the cockpit believed that he did it by just this method that we've just been describing, isolating the left AC bus. It wouldn't really cause him to lose too much capability. It would allow him to isolate the SATCOM in a way that's pretty predictable. However, I've pointed out that there's still some problems. One is that he really wouldn't have any motivation for doing this. It's also something that pilots are just kind of trained to not even think about doing. But at any case, it seems like it would be plausible from the perspective of like, at least he wouldn't be just putting himself in great danger by doing it. However, lately, in recent years, there's been a lot of speculation that the pilot might have done something a bit more dramatic, which is not just to isolate the left AC bus, but to isolate the entire electrical system, try to turn everything off, which sounds like a radical thing to do, and it is a really radical thing to do. And Bob, I asked you to try doing that. To do that, you would then have to also turn off the right-hand generator, the right backup generator, and the right tie bus, so that now, and then also there's an APU that would kick in if you do those things, that's going to try to save. This plane is really built to like kind of desperately preserve its electrical power no matter what. If you do all of those things, well, maybe you could tell me what happens when you do all of those things. You basically try to completely turn off the entire plane.
On the way to being completely switched off electrically, you start to see more and more failures accumulating, or more, they're not really failures, they're just things that you've turned off. They're not failed, they're not broken, they're just turned off. Because you can certainly turn on the switches again and bring them back whenever you want to. They're not stalemates, but it's a list of quote-unquote failures that are on the ICAS. As you work towards that, and I was in autopilot during these tests, and I was surprised how long it took, how many buttons I had to press till the autopilot finally turned off. And I think I was out of the left side of the electrical panel, had that all turned off, the panel above the captain's seat, and was just getting into the right-hand engine electrical system. I can't remember exactly when the autopilot turned off and I was back to just flight director. So the ELMS is just going crazy in the background, trying to redirect and reroute electricity to the most important things, until finally it's like, okay, even the ELMS itself gets to the point where you start to see ELMS information, and also AIMS, which is Aircraft Information Management System. That's a whole other thing. There are so many systems in this airplane that are trying to avoid the worst case scenario, and it's incredibly well designed. every time I pressed the button, I would close my eyes and grit my teeth. I'm like, oh God, now what? Is it going to drop out of the sky? Nothing, nothing. Moving towards the full panel on the overhead there, switched off. The list is growing on the iCast, and then you can toggle a switch to scroll through. And basically, you're turning the entire airplane off. I can see the coffee pots are turned off. I can see the galley ovens are turned off. You can see every single item, and that's what makes Level D, the Level D experience more realistic, and maybe, it might help to solve this mystery. And that's the real reason why I'm taking a slight risk here to help with this information, because I think there's valuable information here that could help with this story.
So if you isolate both buses and you prevent the APU from turning on, this auxiliary turbine in the back of the plane that can also power the electrical system, at some point this device called the RAT, the ram air turbine, drops down from the fuselage and works as a sort of windmill to generate electricity. Did you see that happen?
Absolutely. I did indeed have to watch closely for the APU to start automatically when the second, the right side, the left and right sides of the electrical system were shut off, and indeed that did happen. So turned off the auxiliary power unit. And you're right, it is in the tail of the aircraft. The ram air turbine did become active very quickly. With the loss of electrical, and the ram air turbine, it is supplying hydraulic and electrical power. I'm not sure what percentage of the aircraft it's covering with that, but in that condition of the electrical panel above my head it was turned off completely. Auxiliary power unit was off to be turned on again at any time. The RAT, which deploys automatically and is not retractable. It's something that stays out till you're back on the ground. As the aircraft is fully controllable, the controls felt heavier.
Okay, you didn't have autopilot anymore. I mean, most of the cockpit was dark. Yeah, most of your controls were, the displays were mostly dark. You're seeing your little display that shows you the attitude of the plane, and you can still see like GPS waypoints.
Yeah, all of your flight plan in the CDU, control display unit, is still there. Radios on the captain's side. I checked the lights were still on there. I had full instrumentation on my side, but as soon as we got to a certain point in the switches, probably when we got to the bus tie on the right side after the main generator was turned off, the whole cockpit went dark except for the captain's side of the aircraft. And the captain's side, if I have the information correct, is being driven at that point, is being powered by the aircraft battery. And nothing else comes along to help it, and that's the RAT. The RAT steps in, it takes over. Now it's supplying the electricity to the full system that's still remaining, whatever's remaining from the electrical system. And then eventually, it wasn't long, the first officer's instrumentation came back to life. So all that's running on the RAT. And the hydraulic on the RAT is helping with the, we don't have failed engines, so we still have hydraulics. Electrically speaking, the RAT is doing most of the work now, so.
Okay. So you're losing a lot of capabilities. You're losing pretty much everything except, the bare minimum of what the pilots need to control the plane, to navigate, and to communicate. But you've lost all your bells and whistles. And this is a thing that I just want to emphasize, that time and time again, pilots have told me they do not want to mess with the electrical system unless the iCast, these emergency checklists pop up on the display panel and tell them do this, 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 and this. So this is something that's very antithetical to pilots. And I would say that even though this plane can still be flown, you're putting the plane in a really radical state that it doesn't want to be in, and that doesn't give you any advantage as the pilot. This doesn't serve any purpose that I can discern. And so, whereas I think that isolating the left-hand AC bus is I think not entirely plausible, but still kind of makes sense. I find that this idea that some YouTubers like Green Dot and Mentor Pilot have put forward is really pretty out there. And so it's not impossible, but I think we need to recognize that it's a pretty bizarre idea. And there is a better one. I think isolating the left-hand AC bus is a better one, as flawed as it is.
Certainly turning off a large proportion of the electrical system of the aircraft. And yeah, it becomes dangerous to fly now. You could still fly just fine, but it has absolutely no redundancy now. It's all just very, very basic, rudimentary. Yeah. There's not much left.
That's great. Well, listen, this has been incredibly instructive. You know, this is episode 1 of the new season, and I'm happy that you're able to bring something. The point that I want to keep driving home is that there is so much investigating that remains to be done into this case. The Australian officials promised the public that they would find this plane, that they wouldn't rest until they found it. They didn't. They stopped, and they kind of said, well, that's all we can do. There's plenty more to be done. And I think in the season to come, I'm going to do as much as I can with the help of experts like yourself, by people who have specific technical knowledge. We won't know the answers if we don't ask the questions. And so I'm grateful that you were able to get into Cat D and share it with us. And I hope you'll bring us more tidbits as you encounter them down the road.
Hey, Jeff, thanks so much. I'm honored to be a part of the program here. The podcast is exciting. I've been watching it for quite a while. And anything I can contribute, I'm going to do that whenever I can.
Well, there you have it. That is our first episode of season 2. Hoped you liked it. It's been a bit strange flying solo. The first 31 episodes, the ones of season 1, we did together with Andy Tarnoff, who's a great co-host. In this episode, I've had to take it in a new direction. But I hope that you find some value in it. Would love to hear your questions, comments. Of course, always, if you want to subscribe, that helps out a lot. We're kind of starting from scratch. All of the original episodes are going to be still on the original homepage. You can still view them there. And I will also be checking questions if you want to have a question about the original episodes. Anything else, anything new, bring it here. If you want to see things, let me know. So again, this is Deep Dive MH370 Season 2. Thanks for joining me.